You're listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I am joined today by Scott Simonelli. He is the founder and CEO of Veritonic, Inc. Scott, welcome to the program.
Welcome. Thanks for having me, Heather.
So, Scott, you and I were just talking about the industry here in podcasting, and Veritonic really has been around for a long time, but it sounds like you started more as an audio company and didn't focus solely on podcasting. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to be here?
Sure. Yeah, the North Star for us from really the beginning, and this is 2015, right? So you're kind of existing in a universe where smart speakers don't exist, AirPods aren't in everybody's ears, and there's podcasting, but what's a podcast kind of thing. And the North Star was really, can we build a company that can quantify human response to sound? And can we sit there and can we put some hard quantitative data around how somebody's going to feel when they hear something? And there's a lot of unique properties to audio versus any other medium. And I'd come from a weird set of circumstances where I was writing music at Sony for Sony artists and doing a lot of TV ads, running a lot of music for TV ads. And it was a very frustrating job because, once the whole music in the context of video world is really strange. And once somebody experiences audio and video together, they think it's a fit just because you heard it together once. It's hard to unhear it. And also in that world, the audio is tremendously undervalued, right? If you think about the emotional response from a video, 95% of the budget is probably spent on the visual and 5% of the audio, but it's not that way from a response standpoint, especially with things like recall and intent. And so the emotional response comes from the sound, and nobody hums the copy or the visual, as my mentor at Ogilvy used to say. So shout out to Carl Westman there. So with that, at that same time, I also happened to be part of the first commercially available A/B testing company online. So I was seeing how experimental design and statistical analysis can bring quantitative data to the internet, right? And the internet's relatively linear. Somebody clicks and they kind of go down this path. And we're able to say, hey, when you change this button from red to green, or say click here versus buy now, we see a 0.5% difference. And that's quantifiable. And that in some cases could mean millions and millions of dollars. So while writing music for a Bank of America ad and having Bank of America optimizing their mortgage application form, I call it the flux capacitor moment. The lightning bolt kind of hit me as somebody should do this. There should be technology that does this. And then I did a bunch of other things. And in 2015, I felt like it was the right time to start the company. And we were early for some things, but music for TV was an early use case. We started right away in that world. And then sonic branding kind of came shortly thereafter. And we still do a lot of work in the sonic branding and audio strategy space. And then by 2018, things really started to change. And that's when we see a little more of the universe as we know it now.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you study sound and audio and the way that people respond to it? Are you using some sort of AI technology to understand the way people respond to sound?
Yeah, that's a great question because as you certainly know from your business and probably just experiencing this stuff, it's a very fragmented ecosystem. And back to the internet as an analog, you have clicks are awesome, right? Somebody's or taps or whatever you're doing, right? Somebody's interacting with something, and then a purchase or the desired behavior is not far from there. It happens there. Mm-hmm. You think of audio, not only are you unable to figure out how when they're watching a TV ad or even listening to something or in the car, you don't have the interaction happening, and it usually doesn't happen in the moment. Mm-hmm. Or someone can hear an ad in their car and then buy something on a website later. And it's hard to track how long somebody remembers a jingle or a piece of music, and for most people, it's their whole lives, which is kind of crazy. And so we had to look at how can we manufacture the audience to inform machine learning. And again, this is 2015, so AI existed, but it wasn't really a thing. But to inform those kinds of things, which are basically predictive models, right? How can we train predictive models based on user behavior? And the challenge more is, if you know how to train models, that's one thing. It's getting the user behavior is a whole nother can of worms. And so what we did is we basically, underneath Veritonic's products, we are able to source panel data for any audience globally. And you name it, from mothers with two children who buy chocolate milk only on Tuesdays in New York City versus 24-year-old single person who lives in Brazil. So like, that exists. And then what we're able to do is in a standardized way, put audio experiences in front of in front of the panel data. Now that starts out as a very inefficient process because you're just basically running panel survey company. But we, from the beginning, had that North Star of quantifying human response to sound. And the goal is always to be like, okay, well, this is going to be inefficient at first. And then every day it's just going to get a little smarter and a little smarter and a little smarter. It took about 4 years to where the system starts to say, okay, well, I've seen a 13-hour audiobook before, or I've seen an audio logo before, or I've seen music in the context of video or a podcast ad. And it's got these sonic properties. And so we're also, while we're sourcing those responses, we're ingesting millions of data points in the audio itself. So we're taking that sonic analysis, marrying up with the human response. And over time, what you start to do is say, well, if it sounds like this, Heather's likely to respond this way. And then we can check and see if people like Heather responded that way. And then that just makes the system smarter. And now in a world of generative AI, if you can come with a mountain of data, you can really inform a generative AI model and use case. And still the market isn't, well, as much as people love AI, I think people are looking more for actual statistical significance and data, and they still value the human capital. It's like, but with podcast attribution and these other kind of networks and plumbing in place, we're able to not just use panel data, but use real clicks and actions, because that didn't exist in 2015. We didn't have an attribution product back then. So you're getting that in-market feedback also. And then you also have the predictive piece. So it becomes a bit of a snowball, and we're getting there. We'll look at AI as it's really more of do people trust it versus our capability of doing it. And so we're going to try to just offer that spectrum of statistical significance versus predictive capabilities in a way that fits the use case of the end user and our clients.
Right, absolutely. So essentially, you have grown from being just an audio kind of analytic company to a full-blown analytics company for advertising measurement with a basis in how does audio and sound impact that in consumer. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think the next leg of this race, I think, is really the connectivity. It's kind of come full circle, right? We did a lot of audio in the context of video when we first started, but now it's also like connecting this to other metrics in the media mix. And so like we just launched one of our first connected TV campaigns, with a partner a couple of weeks ago. And it's partly to analyze connected TV, but it's really the more significant thing there, in my opinion, is how does the CTV advertising fit in with the podcast ads? Right? And can we look at those things together? And can I take the streaming campaign and the podcast campaign, and then not only did what happened, but what was the creative, right? And that it's not an empty shell of just clicks, right? And our ability to understand the creative in real time is a big differentiator for us. So if you're doing attribution or brand lift or any kind of like performance measurement, we can get a lot more into the why, because we have that second-by-second analysis of the audio itself. We can tell you, hey, when you say this at 3 seconds into the ad, this influences it, or these unique things like recall and attention that are very specific to audio and those emotional responses, not just did somebody click. And with all the evolving, kind of metrics in social and TV and just downloads, right? It could be here all day talking about how downloads are changing. We have to kind of evolve with that, but audio has to connect to the marketing budget and to the marketing landscape and the advertising landscape in order to grow more.
Right.
And that's something that I think is something we're keen to do. And I think connected TV is a great way to start there. As well, obviously with digital and these other things as well.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that we talk about a lot that I'm curious what your thoughts are on is that when you are on, let's say, Instagram and you see an ad, there's like the shop now button, there's like ways to take immediate action. And part of the issue I sometimes think with audio is that most people don't just sit and listen to audio, like you're doing something else. And I will say, our phones are usually never out of arm's reach, but even if I have my phone and I'm doing some activity, if I hear an ad for a product that I like, I'm not super likely to stop everything I'm doing and go to the website and actually like purchase that product right then. So when you talk about the response that people are having to an ad, and I think that this applies to CTV as well. And one of the thoughts that I've had recently is, why in the world don't more ads have QR codes on them? And I have been noticing an increase because everybody sits on the couch with their phone anyways.
Right.
Like, why not just be able to scan instantly and, access that advertiser? But there still is that disconnection with CTV and with podcasts. So when you're analyzing that audio data to say, oh, this part of the ad was the part where people responded more, how can you measure that response? Is it that action is taken at that specific moment, or is it that part of the ad appealed to someone, they recalled it later, and then were able to take action? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there.
Sure.
To try to simplify it, I think there's kind of two main things. One of them is attribution, right? And attribution is a dark art in a lot of ways, right? Because there's multi-touch, there's first touch, last touch. There's all these different ways to see if something was attributable. And that, by the way, tons of advertising has that. That's not an audio specific problem. And again, not to beat the dead horse on the internet, but the internet's got the best case scenario.
Right.
I mean, e-commerce is as clean as you get. They clicked on the Google ad, they went to the website, and cookies are persistent. So if you come back for a period of time, like, they're going to get you. They're going to find out if you bought or not. Mm-hmm. TV and audio have a different kind of set of challenges there on just the attribution aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And that's where you have to kind of look to other things, leading indicators. We should be as good as we can at doing it. QR codes, better experiences in apps. So unfortunately, a lot of people experience podcasts in like Apple Podcasts, where it's unlikely to have a way to click or interact with the app. And so, we have to predict where we can, and then get human responses through the best case scenario on clicks and attribution, all the pixels and all the things we have. And that's where unfortunately, the reality of panel data and those sort of things come into play. And so when we're doing in-market analysis on brand lift, for example, you can do pixel-based brand lift, which is kind of looking at more of an attribution style, but you can also look at like forced exposure. Mm-hmm. You're gonna have to go find a sample of people who know the brand or have heard the ad and things like that. And that's more in the market research realm than the analytics realm.
Right.
And requires like a different style. That's been a challenge for us to develop those products. Thankfully, we came from the creative measurement space, which was brand lift, which is in-market research for people who don't know. Right? And for a lot of brand advertisers on podcasts, that is their actual. If I'm Pepsi or Chipotle or whatever, I don't have a click. Right. Mm-hmm. So the only way to get this research is that way. And every form of research has its pros and cons or flaws and things that you're certain about. But like ultimately, brand lift, you have to have that panel aspect of it, and it has to scale. Right. A lot of podcast campaigns don't have enough of an audience that you can go source. So we actually, what we call Brand Lift Pulse is our modeled brand lift product. So we're using our predictive capabilities in conjunction with the panel in the same way we do in creative measurement. And that Veritonic audio score flows through. And so I think brand lift is the most exciting area in audio attribution right now, not attribution, funny enough, because I think brand advertisers spend more than everybody else. Mm-hmm. And DR and a lot of these more direct response focused advertisers fueled a lot of podcast advertising growth. But without a really good brand lift system that can scale, be global, have an approach that can run on the long tail, but also have the human capital, right? That credibility of enough people saw this under it, and the creative analysis. You need kind of all that, because we can't just be standard brand lift. You can't be the brand lift that everybody's using for TV or whatever. The audio version has to be better because we don't have the credibility of those mediums. So it's like anything else. Like when you have to overcome something, you have to not only be feature parity with generic brand lift provider X, you have to have the audio specific aspects of it that make it special to stand out. And sometimes that's even more work. But I think that to answer your question, or put a punctuation on that, is it's really hard to figure out direct one-to-one attribution in audio right now. Mm-hmm. And the nature of the product, not to be a pessimist, I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm supposed to be an optimist. That's probably never going to happen. It never really happened for TV. Mm-hmm. Like people just found other ways to quantify, whether it's TV ratings or other things people did in those mediums. It's not going to be the internet. We're more digital than terrestrial radio. We're more digital than over the air television, and we're probably more trackable in digital than CTV in a lot of ways. I would say we've got a little bit of a lead there. Some people may disagree, but that said, it's not perfect. And when people are coming to audio for the first time with those expectations, that's the burden on us to educate those people. And that's the burden on the audio space to educate those people. And that's why we have to have enough people doing this to raise that bar. Mm-hmm. And I think, that's why I never see anything we do as a zero-sum game. I hope there's lots of companies doing this because that's what it takes.
Right.
You're not going to educate the entire advertising landscape with Veritonic, right? You're going to need a lot of people, and that takes time. And we'll get there. But that's and you laid out a pretty tough math problem. But time and patience, and I think the more consumption of podcasts as that starts to happen, that will drive it as well. The more dollars that get spent, the better everybody gets at it because they're incentivized to do so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, so I think you bring up such a good point with direct response advertisers and brand advertisers. And gosh, being in the ad sales space for so many years now, I would love more than anything to say that we had more brand advertisers that were coming in. And of course, we love our direct response advertisers. And I think that it's important that we are establishing ourselves as a direct response medium and it's so fascinating when I talk to buyers, a handful of buyers will say, podcasts are definitely top of funnel. And then others will say, oh, podcasts are definitely lower funnel. And it's just so interesting to see people's perceptions. But we do know from research that we do tend to be more bottom of funnel because there are more direct response advertisers than any other type. However, I think the importance of the products that you are facilitating at Veritonic are so important to brand advertisers. And I love this idea that you aren't just trying to create what has been created or to create the standard, but to go above the standard. And I think that piece in and of itself is so important because, as you mentioned, we have to have brand advertisers in the space. And I'm still, I have had recently some meetings with some bigger holding company agencies, and I'm still shocked at the few number of advertisers that they are really directing toward the space. I'm curious what you're seeing on your end. Do you feel like there are more brand advertisers that are interested?
Well, there collectively are more than there were before. And we've seen that just through our tracking, through our spend data, just observing our business. That number hasn't gone down. Mm-hmm. It's not the kind of thing, there's a real wave in DR, and there's been some big DR businesses that have been very vocal about audio advertising being part of their business, right? There's that handful of brands you might see at a podcast movement or some of the events that people in our space are going to be around. And there's a few, but there's not 50, right? At those conferences or in those places. And so and brand advertising takes on some different forms, right? There's still a lot of money spent on radio as part of a budget, not necessarily podcasting, although those things start to blur together. There's still a big budget that might go towards whatever, sports radio or some of these things that are news radio, things like that. They're just going to be massive buying reach, not really caring about attribution. So those things definitely are there. We've definitely seen more brand advertising taking audio more seriously. A sonic strategy in 2015 was not unheard of. And then it went through a phase where it was kind of cute and new. And now it's like, okay, well, if you don't have a sonic strategy, you're not even looking at podcast advertising. That's maybe not great, but we're not in I don't see, it's like, well, you have to kind of get to the level where if I'm not doing audio and if I don't have data, you're getting fired, right? There was a period where people were like, it seems to keep coming up, but it works. The internet, right? There was a period where people said I'd never sell online, right? I'm never going to sell shoes online. People, how are they going to figure that out?
I agree, right?
No one's going to put their credit card in. I heard all those things, right?
Oh, yeah.
Starting my first company. And I think audio, but then it got to a place where there's an online marketing person. And then it was like, well, you can test different versions. No, I know the version that's going to work. You get those things I'm just going to copy Amazon's click here button. And then that obviously all went away. But audio is still I always joke with other people in the space, it's late and early at the same time. There's some things we do that are very mature, right. 8 years into the space. And there's some things we do where it's I'm just going to copy the Amazon button or whatever. What are we talking about? It's we just started doing this yesterday. And those two things kind of exist at the same time right now, which is odd. I didn't experience that when I was working in the early days of the internet, because it did happen it happened much faster. I think that's a little different, but we are growing. To your question, like brands are more comfortable. There is more information for them. Every day there's more. Every day there's more. And every day they have, whether it's a big holding company or something they're reading on LinkedIn or this podcast, there's going to be other ways for them to learn. And there's going to be a podcast. There's going to be that one person at the company, not all of them, that's going to have a podcast that they love.
Right.
Even shows like Only Murders in the Building, which I don't know if you've ever watched that show. Great show. Mm-mm. It's about a podcast. It's just a mainstream show on Hulu with Steve Martin and Martin Short and Selena Gomez. I highly recommend it.
Okay.
I don't watch a lot of TV, but that's one that I would say go for. But literally, the show is about a podcast. It's about a true crime podcast. And so, like it's mainstream, right? So podcasts are hitting the zeitgeist, but at the same time, it hasn't had that like kind of rapid tipping point to where if you're not doing this, you're getting fired. And people will always respond to the painkiller before the vitamin.
Right.
And I don't know exactly what changes that. Because social had that phase too. Social had a big kind of early phase and then ran really quickly when everybody just started using Facebook. And I think this might be more like YouTube. Mm-hmm. YouTube took a while.
It did take a while.
And it's right. And people don't remember that when Google first acquired YouTube, it was like, what? Why? And now YouTube is, don't quote me on this, I'm pretty sure it's a really large portion of Google's revenues.
I have heard that. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure somebody can look this up. Fact check me on that. But it's not small. And the fact is, like, YouTube, gets as much advertising as anywhere else. And that took a while. Mm-hmm. And it was like, it went through its like sneezing panda phase, or these like Charlie bit my finger, or these like, early YouTube videos that got a bunch of views. Now it's like massive long tail, mm-hmm. right? Where you can find absolutely, my father-in-law, who's 83 years old, discovered YouTube and he can go watch Andy Griffith or like some crazy thing about World War II or whatever. But the algorithm has figured out the 83-year-old guy in his chair.
Right.
Podcast is more like that. Mm-hmm. Right, where like there's a podcast for everything, and it's gonna take time. And I think that would be my optimistic view of it: is more brands will come, more advertisers will come, more dollars will come, but it'll happen more through a growing long tail than a hockey stick of enthusiasm, or just kind of like a quick hit.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that I always go back to with a podcast listener is their level of engagement. And I also really believe that there are definitely people who listen to podcasts that are very difficult to reach in other places.
Right.
And I think it's its own little kind of microclimate in a lot of ways. Obviously, none of us lives in a bubble. Everyone is on the internet to some extent. But when you think about that ability to really have influence over someone, when they're really dedicated to this medium, they're dedicated in a different way, I think, than I don't think anybody feels like a particular affinity for like Instagram or TikTok or even YouTube, to be honest, right? Like maybe there's a YouTube channel that you really love. But I think that in podcasting, it feels like there are audience members, there are listeners that just love audio. And I mean, obviously that's why you've created a company like you have, because audio is very special. And to the people that it resonates with, it resonates significantly, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'm an audio person. I think, full disclosure, we're both audio people. But look, there's a lot of science behind this. I mean, the power of audio is well documented. I could do a whole other podcast on why audio gets the kinds of responses and the richness of responses that it does. It's biological, but it's also, no pun intended, amplified by the way people consume it these days. It's literally in your ear. Right. So like the relationship and the intimacy of how you're experiencing the content is much more personal, with an AirPod in your ear, but also like it's the recall factor and the way somebody's voice sounds and the things that you're going to remember tomorrow and the level of engagement, right? It's just a different type of medium. It's a different way to experience something. And there are the audio people who are just more audio first. It's hard to argue that we don't live in a visual world, but there's also like, saturation on the visual side, mm-hmm. In the sense that, what else can we look at? So I think that's the case for audio still having some room to run here, is like you can only doom scroll for so long. You can only stare at a screen for so long. We're all on Zoom all the time. So like
Mm-hmm.
for me, like when I put on my audiobook, it's like, oh my God. Even if I don't have my eyes closed, it's like it's even more of a respite because I'm not using my eyes.
Right.
I've stared at email all day. I've done all this stuff, and so I think that, but it is a biological thing. There's a science behind it, and I think the digital platforms and the way audio gets consumed and tracked, and analytics and all the things we do and people in our space do, has to continue to evolve with that. It's come a long way, right? There were books on tape and terrestrial radio, where it's better. It's better than it was in 2015. But I think we have a lot more work to do on the plumbing and connecting to the person and understanding how they're consuming the content. And there needs to be more widespread data. There's a lot of like siloed data. For example, Spotify is a walled garden. SXM is going to be there's a lot of walled gardens out there, whereas like it's not the internet.
Right.
Right. There's some, like Edison does a great job of looking at share of ear. There are people who kind of look across these things. But it's still not like one of those things that we're able to look at as broadly and with the level, broadly and telescope wise, but also microscope wise. It's hard to put those things together. But we're getting there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, Scott, it's been a pleasure having you on the program today. And I just appreciate the work that you've done in this space. I know that we have a lot of work left to do, but we know that there is value in audio. And it is really exciting to see the advancements that we've been making and that you and the team at Veritonic is making in that ability to really track what is happening with your advertising. Because as you said, I do really believe that we're getting to a place where if a marketing person doesn't have a strategy with audio, they're really missing a big part of an addressable market. And so, it's terrific that we can continue to really advocate for the space. And we didn't touch too much on video or integration, but, audio still plays a huge role in that piece, in that advertising landscape. And it's exciting. We'll just continue to watch how things unfold. But if people want to connect with you or find out more about the work you guys are doing, where can they reach you?
Veritonic.com. And I'm being the founder to get the first name. So Scott at Veritonic, if you just want to send me an email. But look, as you can probably imagine, you're absolutely right. There's a lot to be done here, a lot of work to be done. And, certainly our team and everybody in our space, having just come from Podcast Movement, there's a lot of hardworking people who are dedicated to seeing all this stuff happen. And that's exciting. There's an energy level. I think I felt this podcast movement that, is contagious. And I think we're seeing growth in our space. It's really the question of the pace of that growth, and how fast we can start to realize these things. And I think there's a lot to like. And I think the key thing is like people spending the time to learn more. Mm-hmm. And I think that will help more than anything else. Advertisers, marketers kind of looking at what they can do differently, what they can learn. That's how the space will grow. And I look forward to that. So anybody wants to reach me, I'm sure they can find me. Thank you for having me and appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for being on. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have. If you're interested in checking out my YouTube, where we're creating some great content, head on over and search up Heather Osgood. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.